Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Today, we're going to be looking at the history of Juneteenth. And Chris, I think you were telling me right before we started recording that Juneteenth is one of two of the most recent federal holidays.
Yeah, the first one was in 1983, and that was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And then we have this one, which comes about in 2021, which is Juneteenth, which has many people considering it to be our country's second Independence Day. And, you know, honestly, this has been celebrated for many, many years in the African American community. But this monumental event has basically remained unknown to most Americans until last year. There was a big push of really recognizing, once again, history you didn't know but should, some of the events that took place in American history that should have great relevance in today's society.
Absolutely, because when you think about the end of slavery in the United States, everybody goes back to January 1st, 1863 and the Emancipation Proclamation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation that really sort of sealed the deal on slavery in the United States. It was the events that we celebrate when we celebrate Juneteenth here in the U.S. now.
And I think that anybody who studies this period of American history can become very confused by the concept of the Emancipation Proclamation, because January 1st, 1863, you have enslaved but also free African Americans who gather all throughout the country, and they're just waiting for January 1st to take place. Because at that moment, they know that the Emancipation Proclamation is going to go into place, which is going to free the enslaved. The problem is that the Emancipation Proclamation was designed for those individuals who were enslaved in the Confederate States, which, Ray, if we know about this time period, the North was the North, the South was the South, Confederacy and the Union. I mean, the Confederacy had split. So anything that Abraham Lincoln did, including the Emancipation Proclamation, saying that it was going to make everybody free, really looked good on paper, but in reality, it didn't take place in all of the Confederate States and in all of the United States of America at that time.
Yeah, it didn't apply to, like you said, it didn't apply. It freed slaves in the Confederacy or areas under Confederate control, but it couldn't actually take effect until those areas under Confederate control were under Union control, number one. And I've got several books on slave narratives from North Carolina and South Carolina. And it's interesting to read where slaves talk about Union soldiers coming into their community in Fayetteville or wherever. And they're obviously excited because that means freedom is coming. And part of that was because of the Emancipation Proclamation, because the freedom that the proclamation promised them would only become a reality when Union soldiers, Union forces were there on the ground to make that a reality. And then, of course, you've got another group that was not included in the Emancipation Proclamation, and that were those slaves in the so-called border states.
And being the fact that this was in 1863 when we're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation going into effect, but the Confederacy, these border states, this is a large area of the United States that we're talking about, and we do not have the internet, don't have telephones. We do not have, communication takes a very, very long time to kind of get from one point to the next. And there is this large Confederate state of Texas, but in the westernmost part of Texas. I guess in today's area, it's kind of like Galveston or Galveston Bay, Texas, which is, if you look at a map, just compared to North Carolina, it just seems like it's on another planet. during that particular time. And so those individuals, aware that a war is going on, I mean, they know a war is going on, but the war is not really affecting them. They're living their lives, unfortunately, as enslaved, as part of the Confederacy, and really not knowing what's happening. So up until even 1865, these individuals are kind of hearing some bits and pieces of things that are happening, but the Union's nowhere close to occupying that Confederate territory, thereby making the Emancipation Proclamation meaningful or applicable to them.
Yeah, and what's very interesting is that we're going to be talking about events that occurred in June of 1865 there in Galveston, Texas. But it was months earlier when General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse there in Virginia. So the war was really over. But like you said, because how long it took information to travel, how long it took news to go from one place to another, and also, let's face it, slaveholders in Texas weren't exactly biting at the bit to share this information with their slaves. So it took a long time for this information to get across the states to Galveston, where these people were living. And of course, you also had, by this particular time, in process, it wouldn't be ratified till December 1865, but you had the 13th Amendment ending slavery as well. That was in the work. So a lot was going on, and these people in Galveston, like you said, they were completely unaware that the war was over. The Confederacy had lost. Slavery was ending and would, in just a few months, be ended for good in the United States of America. But of course, what happens in Galveston in June of 1865, actually, I think, frees the last slaves in America.
And it's you once again, I think we have to think about the traveling of the news, but also the traveling of the troops. Thinking about the Civil War, we see this as a North-South kind of a thing and don't really think about the West, but there were a lot of battles fought in Mississippi and Kentucky and Tennessee and those particular areas. So when you start seeing in April of 1865, as you mentioned, the Confederate Army surrendering to the Union Army, we are still going to have a delay for the Union soldiers to make their way to Galveston, Texas. And finally, on June 19th, 1865, you do have the Union General Gordon Granger, who does bring Union troops into Galveston Bay, Texas. And what I find interesting is that I believe there were about 2,000 Union soldiers that come into Galveston Bay. And it just so happens that the majority of those Union soldiers who make their way to Texas were Black individuals. And I find that to be very satisfying and very interesting that the enslaved in Galveston are told, you are no longer enslaved, but you are free by the executive order of the President of the United States, that you are now free. I just think that that's a huge moment in history that, unfortunately, until 2021, in general history terms, was largely forgotten.
Yeah, it didn't get the attention it certainly deserves. I mean, this is a major turning point in American history. We talk about, like we said, the Emancipation Proclamation, very important, very necessary, but it didn't really fulfill its promise, I guess we could say, until June of 1865, when these soldiers went into Galveston and said to some 200,000+ slaves there, you are free. You are no longer enslaved. You're no longer bound. You're no longer in bondage. You are now free to live your lives. And of course, what a wonderful piece of news that would have been.
But think about what you just said, 250,000. I mean, that's larger than a lot of the cities that we experience in today. I mean, 250,000 who had been enslaved in that moment, long after the war had ended, long after the Emancipation Proclamation. And it just shows the extreme injustice that enslaved people faced, because the plantation owners were in constant contact with one another through the selling of a variety of different things. The plantation owners knew that the selling of enslaved people had shifted in places such as Georgia and South Carolina and things of that nature. They knew what was going on, but yet they still tried to prevent it. They tried to hold on to that aspect of life for them as long as they could, until it took these soldiers coming down and offering a decree and offering this prayer of hope and of just good news to all people. And it's called Juneteenth because it happened on June 19th. And therefore, that is the day in which I think we can say that all enslaved people were free by executive decree. But as you mentioned, it wouldn't be until December that the 13th Amendment comes in, which banishes slavery.
The year is sort of bookended. 1865 is sort of bookended with, the second inauguration of Abraham Lincoln in 1865, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, June 19th, and then, of course, at the end of 1865 with the passing of the 13th Amendment.
But it does also need to be said that when those soldiers came into Galveston Bay and announced the freedom that they would now have, it's not just an immediate change. They have been enslaved for over 200 years. And now comes the point when they need to try to reunify families that have been torn apart. This is when you start to establish a new life, even in the midst of a country that doesn't necessarily accept the new life that has been given to them. And so we will start to see there is a long period that needs to take place of transitioning from being enslaved to free, to freedom. And that's where you have the Freedmen's Bureau that comes in, which starts to help former enslaved people transition into free people. Excuse me. They provide them with food, clothing, legal representation. We start seeing the schools come up and basically just start helping individuals establish their new lives, all in the midst of a group of people who aren't happy about this. So Juneteenth is a second Independence Day. It is a moment in which people celebrate, because at that moment we start to see the freedom that was rightfully deserving of these individuals. It starts to come into place. But unfortunately, our nation will not easily accept Juneteenth. And I mean, dare I say, Ray, I don't know if the nation has completely accepted Juneteenth even in 2023. I think that there is still this divide that affects us. And I think that goes once again to history you didn't know but should, understanding the horror and the terrible acts of injustice that were given to these people, even to the point where they were still enslaved long after a war. And then the transitioning from that was very difficult.
Yeah, and in case people think that Juneteenth is new, that this is something that's just sort of been pulled out of the air, it's not. The first, what we would call Juneteenth, was actually celebrated in 1866 there in Texas, 1 year after the 1865 declaration to the slaves there in Galveston that they were free. And it would be celebrated. All throughout history. It would be celebrated with barbecues and music and prayer services, church services, all that kind of thing. And in fact, in 1979, the state of Texas recognized Juneteenth and made it an official holiday. And other states have followed throughout time. So it's sort of like the federal government was very slow in sort of catching up to where the people were, who were already celebrating it, Jubilee Day, Juneteenth, or the states already recognizing. It just took time for the federal government to get around to doing it. But this is by no means a new thing. This is something that has been around since 1866, been celebrated since 1866. And I think it's a good thing that the federal government finally got around in 2021 to recognizing this very important event in American history.
Yes, because the historical legacy of Juneteenth does show the value of never giving up in uncertain times. And I think as we continue to push for equal rights, and equal rights being equal among a variety of different things in today's society, I think Juneteenth has highlighted the need for us to be reminded that keep fighting, keep standing up, keep speaking out, keep pushing forward, that we become a society that doesn't just hear what others are saying, but listens to what other people are saying, respect what other people have experienced and what they are experiencing, and that we just work together to build bridges, to build relationships, and to connect, especially in these uncertain times. And I think Juneteenth, the things that we are going through today can never come close to that which was experienced by these that were enslaved. But I think hearing the stories of those who were enslaved and the way that they celebrated and still celebrate the ancestors today of those who experienced this travesty, I think is a reminder to us that there is a spirit of hope that lives on, and it lives on through the celebration of Juneteenth.
Yeah, and the preamble of the Constitution, of course, written in 1787, 100 years, just a little around 100 years before the events of 1865, a little less than 100 years. It says this: we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, not a perfect union, but a union that is continuing to grow, that is continuing to become more perfect. And I think that's what this is all about. It's growing in freedom, growing in liberty, and the benefits that can spread to all people. Well, Chris, I think this has been a great episode on the history of Juneteenth. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode. Please share this episode with your family and friends. We're located anywhere you find your podcast. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.